When people ask me how I began to take photographs, unlike many artists, photographers, painters, and writers, I do not have a nice story to tell. No archangel appeared to me in my dreams and said, Gabor Szilasi, go buy a Leica and you will become a great photographer. It was nothing like that. I simply felt the need to take photographs, to put what I saw on film. And so I began to work. When I photographed scenes in rural areas, I did not attempt to create monuments, that is, to create images that could be called typical of a Quebec farmer. I did not attempt to create a hero, but rather to show him in his setting as an ordinary man or woman, a worker, or an elderly retired person living in a village surrounded by young people. I wanted to show an ordinary person. Of course, being Hungarian and not having been born in this society, my outlook is no doubt very different from that of a photographer born here. He sees his own society differently. Thus, I am not so pretentious as to say that my photographs of Quebecers are definitive, that they are exact records of these people. Instead, they are a personal vision, which nevertheless may be quite accurate. In any case, I try to be as honest as possible with respect to the subject. In my opinion, it is not possible to make a definitive image. Even if one contends that the camera does not lie, the image it produces certainly does not correspond to reality, because of the decisions made by the photographer. The camera itself is able to reproduce nature, the scene in front of the camera, exactly. In most cases, you will capture exactly the same light and the same relationship between the principal subject and its surroundings. But the framing of the image, which is a decision made by the photographer, and the further decision when to release the shutter, make it impossible to capture a truly definitive and objective image of the scene. In photography, it might be said that there are two kinds of framing. There is framing by the four sides of the image, of the viewfinder, and there is also framing in time, which may range from 1/1000th of a second to half a second, or several minutes. How then can 250th of a second capture reality? The eye cannot even register 250th of a second. It is a way of seeing peculiar to the camera. This twofold framing, by the limits of the image and by framing in time, therefore gives the photographic image a reality of its own, which does not correspond to the reality that we see. The quality of the subject-photographer relationship is visible in the final photograph. By looking at a portrait, whether it be the environmental or more classical kind of portrait, one can distinguish the kind of interaction between the photographer and the subject. In particular, the expression of the eyes says a great deal. In my opinion, eyes are most important because they mirror minute changes of mood, such as anxiety, pleasure, boredom, excitement, indifference, etc. As soon as I click the shutter, I can tell whether a photograph is going to be a good one of the subject, good in quotation marks, meaning the one that communicates. Again, as I said before, when speaking of a good photograph, I do not mean a definitive portrait of the person. The photograph or portrait will show the subject, say, at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of May 24th, in such and such light and in such and such a pose. It may be an accurate enough record, and is certainly highly specific of that moment and of the atmosphere in that particular room, but it will certainly not be the definitive portrait of the subject. When taking documentary photographs, I try to go beyond simply recording what is in front of me. I try to introduce elements that require some explanation to questions asked, so that everything is not said outright in the photograph, so that certain relationships between the subject and his surroundings, or, if it is simply an interior, between certain objects within the frame, create tensions, juxtapositions, or contrasts. These are the tensions that make the photograph more than just a record. This is what I try to find in my subjects and to create in my photographs, this kind of tension. I would call this element of tension the symbolic or perhaps the metaphoric message in the photograph. It is present in every photograph, but its existence is very important in the one that is more than just a record or a simple representation of a scene. It is precisely this quality that prevents photography from being definitive. On the other hand, however, it is this quality that leaves room for interpretation of the photograph. In the end, it is the subject itself that speaks. The subject contains everything, including this poetic or symbolic aspect. Thus, it is simply a matter of finding the subject. The subject is 90% of photography, and the greatest problem in photography is finding the subject. It may be the only form of artistic expression that is so subject-oriented. The painter, though he may, of course, be influenced by actual situations, can invent his subject. It is natural for him to rearrange reality. And the same is true to the poet and the writer. For the photographer, at least for the straight photographer, however, finding a good subject is the only way of expressing himself. I do not rearrange objects in an interior. Instead of adding or removing things, I will simply change the position of the camera so as to make one object or another more important in my composition. In other words, add a bit of drama. We are all directors to a certain extent, but as for me, I stop at the point of changing objects in an interior.